Every year, the global elite gather in tailored suits to celebrate the ultimate symbol of journalistic truth and honor. Yet the prestigious award they covet was funded by a dynasty built entirely on lies, extortion, and human misery. This is the ultimate paradox of the Pulitzer family history, where public prestige masked a brutal family hell. Most people know the name from the annual awards, but the dark side of the Pulitzer family remains buried under layers of historical myth. The true tragedy was not a sudden loss of wealth, but a slow, calculated destruction orchestrated by the patriarch himself. To understand the rise and fall of the Pulitzers, one must look beyond the gold medals and academic praise. The deepest Pulitzer Prize secrets were not lost to time or bad investments. They were locked away in a terrifying legal document signed in 1911 inside a soundproof floating vault. This single piece of paper did not protect the heirs. It sealed the Pulitzer family tragedy. This Joseph Pulitzer biography is not a story of triumph. It is an autopsy of a family broken by the weight of their own legacy. This is the dark history of the Pulitzer family. The architect of this misery arrived in Boston in 1864. He was a penniless Hungarian immigrant. He was 19 years old. He was frail, half-blind, and desperate. He spoke almost no English, but he possessed a terrifying, predatory intellect. He quickly realized that the American public did not actually want the truth. They wanted blood. They wanted scandal. They wanted to see the powerful dragged through the mud. Joseph Pulitzer did not build his empire by informing the public. He built it by weaponizing their darkest impulses. He bought the St. Louis Post-Dispatch for a pittance. He merged it. He transformed it. He realized that fear sold more papers than facts. Within years, his formula of sensationalism, fabricated headlines, and exposed secrets made him a millionaire. He bought the New York World. He pioneered yellow journalism. He turned the news into a blood sport. He exposed the private sins of the Manhattan elite to feed the hunger of the poor. He became incredibly rich, but greed always demands a price. By his early 40s, his physical body began to break under the pressure of his own ambition. His eyes failed him completely. He became entirely blind. He became hypersensitive to sound. The mere ticking of a pocket watch or the scraping of a chair could drive him into a violent, screaming rage. He had conquered the media landscape of the United States, but he was trapped in a silent, dark prison of his own making. He retreated from society. He lived like a ghost, terrified of the noise of the world he had worked so hard to dominate. But as his physical sight vanished, his desire for total control only intensified. He could no longer see his empire, but he could still rule it from the shadows. His competitors trembled at his name, but his own children lived in absolute terror of his voice. He had constructed a life of quiet isolation, but his home was about to become a psychological battlefield. He demanded absolute submission from everyone who entered his orbit. He was preparing his sons to inherit a kingdom, but his training methods were designed to break their spirits rather than build their strength. They were about to learn that their father was far more dangerous in the dark than he ever was in the light, and the true horror of his vision was only just beginning to take shape. To build a monopoly, you do not need to be liked. You need to be feared. Joseph Pulitzer understood this better than anyone in Gilded Age America. By the late 1890s, his flagship newspaper, the New York World, was no longer just a publication. It was a relentless financial machine. It was generating an annual net profit of more than $1 million. In today's terms, That was an astronomical sum of money. It was a liquid war chest, and Pulitzer intended to use every single cent of it to systematically dismantle his rivals. His primary target was a young, arrogant heir from California named William Randolph Hearst. Hearst had purchased the New York Journal with one single goal. He wanted to wipe Pulitzer off the map. What followed was not a gentlemanly competition. It was an industrial slaughter. The two titans engaged in a bidding war that shocked the financial elite of Manhattan. Hearst would offer Pulitzer's top editors double their salaries. Pulitzer would respond by offering them triple. Cartoonists, investigative reporters, and printing press operators were bought and sold like high-priced commodities. The cost of talent skyrocketed. Pulitzer spent over $500,000 in a single year just to retain his staff. But he had the cash flow of a monopoly. He could absorb the losses. Hearst could not. But wages were only the beginning. To keep the public buying papers, Pulitzer and Hearst realized they needed a bigger story. They needed blood. When tensions flared between Spain and the United States over Cuba, the two press barons saw their ultimate opportunity. They did not report the news. They actively manufactured it. They printed fabricated stories of Spanish atrocities. They published fake interviews. They whipped the American public into a state of nationalistic hysteria. It worked. The United States declared war on Spain in 1898. It was a conflict born in the printing rooms of Manhattan, a war designed specifically to sell newspapers at 1 cent a copy. Pulitzer's daily circulation soared past 1 million copies. He had achieved the ultimate corporate dream. He had created a media monopoly that could dictate American foreign policy. He was no longer just a publisher. He was a kingmaker in Washington. He could destroy a politician with a single front-page editorial. Presidents feared him. Senators lobbied him. But this absolute public power came at a devastating cost. The constant stress of the circulation wars was eating away at his remaining health. He had conquered the media landscape, but his body was failing him. The darkness was creeping in. The man who controlled the nation's narrative was about to lose control of his own mind, and his family would be the ones to pay the price. The empire was secure, but the family was about to enter a silent hell. Joseph Pulitzer did not just build a media empire. He built an architectural fortress designed to keep the entire world at bay. He was one of the richest men on earth, yet he lived like a ghost haunted by his own senses. His wealth had bought him absolute power, but it had also stolen his peace. His nerves were raw. His ears were so sensitive that the scraping of a fork or the rustle of a newspaper could cause him physical agony. To escape the noise of humanity, he designed a monument to isolation. In New York, on East 73rd Street, he constructed a massive mansion. It was a palace of silence. He called its specialized soundproof wing the Tower of Silence. The engineering was terrifyingly precise. The walls were packed with thick layers of mineral wool. The windows were triple glazed to block the hum of the city. Even the floorboards did not touch the beams. They were suspended on heavy brass springs to prevent any vibration from traveling to his ears. It was a tomb of luxury. He sat in the dark, surrounded by millions of dollars, yet utterly alone.
But the land was not quiet enough. So he took to the sea. He commissioned the Liberty. It was a steam yacht measuring nearly 300 feet in length.
It cost him over $300,000 to build, a staggering sum at the turn of the century. The Liberty was a floating fortress of silence. The engines were heavily muffled. The crew wore felt-soled shoes. They communicated using hand signals. No one was allowed to speak above a whisper. Pulitzer did not travel alone. He traveled with his library. This was a rotating group of 6 private secretaries. They were highly educated men hired from elite universities. Their sole purpose was to serve as their master's eyes and ears. They read to him for hours. They summarized daily news. They memorized books on history, art, and politics. If a secretary paused, or if his voice cracked, Pulitzer would erupt in a blind rage. He treated these brilliant men like biological playback machines. His children fared no better. The mansion and the yacht were golden prisons for Ralph, Joseph Jr., and Herbert. They were rarely allowed to speak in their father's presence. When they did, they were subjected to brutal examinations. Pulitzer would quiz them on complex global economics or classical literature. He judged their intellect. He judged their vocal tone. He pitted the 3 brothers against each other in a cruel domestic tournament. He praised one only to humiliate the others. He wanted to forge ruthless successors. He wanted to breed predators. Instead, he systematically shattered their confidence. He taught them how to fight, but he never taught them how to survive each other. The brothers grew up in a world of infinite luxury and zero affection. They had the finest clothes, the grandest estates, and the most prestigious names. But they were psychological casualties before they even inherited a single cent. And as the patriarch's health began to fail completely, he realized he could not take his empire with him. This realization sparked a final, desperate act of control, an act that would ensure his family's ruin long after his heart stopped beating. The end was approaching, and it would arrive on the silent waters of the Atlantic. The illusion of absolute control always shatters at the touch of reality. Joseph Pulitzer believed he had engineered a perpetual motion machine. He believed his shadow would forever guide his sons. He was wrong. The 1920s arrived with a brutal truth. The world was moving faster than the dead man's decree. A new era of media was dawning. It was loud. It was fast. It was electronic. Radio waves were slicing through the air. Tabloid newspapers were printing smaller, sleeker pages with massive photographs. The public no longer wanted the dense, crusading prose of the New York world. They wanted instant gratification. But the Pulitzer brothers could not pivot. They could not adapt. They were locked in a psychological civil war designed by their own father. The distribution of the estate was a masterclass in domestic sabotage. Ralph Pulitzer, the eldest, was handed the title of president of the company. He had the responsibility, he had the public scrutiny, but he was given only 1/10 of the trust's income. Herbert Pulitzer, the youngest, was handed 6/10 of the wealth. He had the money, but he had absolutely no interest in running a newspaper. Joseph Pulitzer Jr. was banished to St. Louis to run the Post-Dispatch with only 2/10 of the share. The arrangement was toxic. It created a volatile cocktail of resentment, exhaustion, and apathy. Ralph worked himself to the bone to protect a fortune that belonged to his younger brother. Joseph Jr. watched from afar, bitter and deeply resentful. Herbert spent his days in European villas, completely detached from the ink and sweat of the press rooms. The brothers were not allies. They were hostages to each other's inheritance. Then came the external pressures. The federal government introduced the income tax in 1913. Estate taxes began to rise. The family's massive cash reserves were no longer safe from the taxman. At the same time, the New York world was losing its edge. The competition was fierce. The daily news was eating their lunch. The Pulitzers responded with pure hubris. They raised the price of their paper. They cut editorial budgets. They believed the Pulitzer name alone was enough to guarantee loyalty. It was a fatal miscalculation. Readers walked away by the hundreds of thousands. Inside the boardroom, the brothers stopped speaking. They communicated through high-priced lawyers. Every decision required unanimous trust approval, which was impossible to achieve. Ralph's health began to fail, mirroring the decline of his father. He was suffering from nervous exhaustion. He was trapped in a financial vice. The newspaper was no longer a printing press for money. It was a black hole. It was swallowing their personal fortunes to keep the presses running. The brothers began to realize the terrifying truth. Their father's golden trust was not a gift. It was a suicide pact. They needed a way out. They needed to destroy the very thing their father had spent his life building. But the dead giant had one final, devastating trap waiting for them in the dark. The Great Depression had arrived. The Gilded Age was dead, and the New York world was bleeding to death. By 1930, the newspaper was losing over $100,000 every single week. That is over $5 million a year in modern terms. The Pulitzer brothers were desperate. They wanted to sell. They wanted to cut their losses, but they were trapped inside a legal nightmare of their own father's making. This brings us back to the secret agreement signed in 1911 inside the soundproof floating vault of the steam yacht Liberty. As Joseph Pulitzer lay dying, he drafted a trust so restrictive it became a financial death trap. He did not just want his sons to run his empire. He wanted to force them to run it forever. The secret clause in that 1911 trust was a masterpiece of legal malice. It explicitly forbade his heirs from ever selling the New York world under any circumstances. If the newspaper lost money, the trust dictated that the losses had to be covered using the family's personal inheritance. The sons were legally obligated to pour their own fortunes into a sinking ship. The empire was quite literally eating itself alive. Imagine the horror. Ralph, Joseph Jr., and Herbert were multimillionaires on paper, but they were watching their wealth evaporate. They were forced to write massive personal checks to pay for newsprint, ink, and labor that nobody wanted anymore. The gold in prison had turned into a financial black hole. By 1931, the situation was critical. The family was facing total ruin. They had only one option left. They had to go to court and plead insanity. Not their own, but their father's. The brothers hired the most expensive lawyers in New York. They launched a desperate, high-stakes lawsuit to break the sacred trust. They had to argue that Joseph Pulitzer was mentally incompetent when he drafted the trust, or that the economic devastation of the Great Depression made his demands impossible to fulfill. They had to expose their father's madness to the world. They dragged the family's private torment into the public record. They presented evidence of the soundproof vaults, the violent rages, and the psychological warfare he waged against his own flesh and blood. The legal battle was brutal. The court was forced to decide between the sacred wishes of a dead titan and the survival of his living heirs. The lawyers argued that if the trust was not broken, the entire Pulitzer fortune would be completely wiped out.
Even the funds set aside for the newly created Pulitzer Prize were at risk of being dragged down into the abyss. In February of 1931, the surrogate court delivered its verdict. Surrogate James Foley ruled in favor of the brothers. He declared that the court had the power to rescue the beneficiaries from the ruinous terms of the trust. The unbreakable contract was shattered. But freedom came at a devastating price. The brothers immediately sold the New York World to the Scripps Howard chain. The sale price was a humiliating $500,000. A decade earlier, the paper was worth tens of millions. It was a fire sale of historic proportions. The new owners did not want the paper. They wanted its subscriber list. Within days of the purchase, the New York World was shut down forever. Nearly 3,000 journalists, editors, and pressmen were thrown onto the streets in the middle of the Great Depression. The Pulitzer brothers had saved their personal fortunes, But they had destroyed their father's legacy. The family name was erased from the masthead of American daily news. They had broken the chains of the golden prison, but the freedom they bought was stained with betrayal. The empire was dead. Now the surviving heirs had to face the ruins of their own lives. The 1931 court ruling did not bring a triumphant new dawn. It brought a quiet, devastating end. The judge broke the trust. The golden chains were cut. But the brothers soon realized they had nothing left to hold on to. The New York World, once the most powerful newspaper on earth, was sold to a rival syndicate for a mere $500,000. It was a humiliating pittance. An asset that once generated millions of dollars annually was sold for scrap value. The new owners did not want the paper. They wanted its subscriber list. Within 24 hours of the sale, the presses stopped. The building was cleared.
Thousands of writers, editors, and printing press operators were thrown onto the streets in the darkest depths of the Great Depression. The Pulitzer name was stripped from the masthead of American daily journalism. The brothers took what remained of their liquidated inheritances and scattered across the globe. They did not build new empires. They did not launch new ventures. They simply tried to disappear. Ralph, who had sacrificed his youth to satisfy his father's impossible demands, retreated into a quiet, shell-shocked retirement. He died less than a decade later, his spirit permanently broken. Joseph Jr. moved to St. Louis, managing the smaller Post-Dispatch, but he lived under the permanent shadow of his father's ghost. Herbert, the favorite son who inherited the largest fortune, spent his remaining years traveling, spending extravagantly, and avoiding any mention of the family business. The wealth did not survive the transition to the next generations. It was systematically eroded. The Great Depression wiped out their stock portfolios. High-profile, bitter divorces sliced the remaining family trusts into smaller and smaller pieces. The federal government extracted heavy estate taxes. By the late 20th century, the immense fortune that Joseph Pulitzer had built on sensationalism and human misery had completely evaporated. The descendants of the great press baron became ordinary citizens, wealthy enough to live comfortably, but entirely stripped of the power their grandfather had wielded. Today, the Pulitzer name is synonymous with the highest standards of journalistic integrity. Every year, the finest minds in media gather to receive the gold medals of the Pulitzer Prize. They celebrate courage, they celebrate truth, they celebrate honor. It is the ultimate historical irony.
The prize is funded by a trust created from the profits of yellow journalism, manufactured wars, and the systematic psychological destruction of three brothers. The public remembers the monument. They forget the graves beneath it. Wealth is not just a tool for building. It is a force of gravity. If it is too heavy, it does not elevate a family. It crushes them. Joseph Pulitzer wanted to build an immortal dynasty. Instead, he built a golden cage that starved his own children of peace, sanity, and freedom. They traded their lives to protect a legacy they were never allowed to truly possess. If you want to understand how the world's greatest fortunes really work, subscribe now. More dark histories are on the way.